So thank you again, everyone, for joining the Education Writers Association for this webinar. Again, the title is Learn About a Handy New Free Education Data Tool. I'm Allison Kowalski, EWA's Program Specialist, and before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions for our speakers, please type them into the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel. Please include your name and affiliation when you ask your question, and please ask your question at any time, and I will get back to them at the end of the webinar when I return and field your questions to our moderator and our panelists. So that being said, let me get ready to introduce you guys to our moderator, Rick Seltzer. He's the project editor for Inside Higher Ed. He's used several of the Urban Institute data tools in his reporting, so he's going to kind of talk you through how to find stories in the data and how he's used it in his work. And then he's joined by Matt Chingos, Vice President of Education Data and Policy for Urban Institute, and Erica Blom, who's a research associate for the Urban Institute. So with that being said, I'm going to pop out of the conversation and come back for the Q&A later, but I'll hand it over to you, Rick.
Thanks so much, Allison. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Depending on who you are, you may be looking at or for outside sources of data for a number of different reasons. I'm going to try to capture different perspectives in some questions and in some discussions, but the best way to make sure this is useful to you in your individual situation is if you can send us questions. So I just want to reiterate what Allison said. Please do send us questions throughout as you think of them. So to jump right in, when I am reporting and storytelling, I like to think of data through two different lenses. The first being verify, and the second is contextualize. So when I think about verifying, that's looking for data so that I can find trusted external sources that are really helpful if I want to prove that what my own in-person sources, people I know, if what they're telling me is actually true. So if I have a college president who says enrollment is down, I want to be able to go to a third-party data source, see if it really has been down over the years, see how much it's down and over what periods of time. When we talk about contextualizing, I like to try to include little data points in my articles that make a story pop. Instead of saying a student found herself on campus where most of her peers were wealthy, maybe I can say 1 out of every 10 enrolled students at a college received Pell Grants, which are the proxy for low-income families. Or maybe I can find a fun or interesting way to compare performance between state flagship institutions in a story that's about finances and otherwise maybe a little dry. What I find more often than not when I go hunting for data, either to validate or to contextualize a story, is that I leave with more questions than I came with. I might answer the original question, but I have a bunch of follow-ups, and I can go and talk to sources for more reporting if I have the time and the ability to, with much more informed questions and create a story that creates more informed discussion. With that being said, why do I think today is important? It's because there are plenty of massive data sets on education floating out there, both K-12 and higher education. They're spread over the internet in a bunch of different places online. And frankly, the interfaces are not always the most user-friendly. It can be a real struggle to download some of these things or find what you're looking for in them. So I think this data tool is really interesting in that it brings together different sources and can be a little easier to use than some of the other places that you have gone for data in the past or could still continue to go for in the future. So with that out of the way, I will stop making you all listen to me and turn it right over to Matt and Erica.
Great. Thanks a lot, Rick, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We're excited to share these new data tools with all of you. So I want to start with just a kind of quick overview of the work, starting with the scope. What data are in the data portal, the Data Explorer? And the scope is all major national data sets on schools, school districts, and colleges. So it's both K-12 and higher ed, the K-12 schools and districts, and then the higher ed colleges, including pretty much all colleges in the U.S. that report data to the federal government. But it's important to emphasize that this isn't data on individual students, and it's also not aggregate data on national trends or state-level trends. It's on these institutions of the schools, the districts, and the colleges. So why did we do this? As Rick mentioned, these data are out there. There's no real new data in what we have in the portal. It's all information you could get somewhere else, but it's often hard to find. If you can find it, it's often hard to work with. It might be posted in a format that you can't read on your computer, or you might have to use some data tool that you have to do a whole bunch of learning just to be able to access one data set. data tend to be in different places. So if you want to get, in the number of teachers in each school, you go to one place. If you want to know information on how many kids are taking an AP course, you go to a different place. So those are different data sets you have to learn, and you have to learn how to put them together. And then on top of that, the data sets often change over time. So if you just want a simple number, Rick mentioned you want to, kind of contextualize a story you're writing, and you heard that, or verify a trend is true, and you heard that, enrollment at the local college has been declining. You want to know, is that true? And is that part of a longer term trend, or is it just a little blip in the data? Has enrollment always been going up and down by a little bit, every few years, and this is just a part of that latest one? Those data are currently available outside of our tools, but you'd have to go and download, maybe 20, 30 different years of data, and then figure out, well, what's the enrollment, column called, and how has that changed, and can we line it up? So what we've done with the Education Data Portal is we've created a one-stop shop for all of these national data sets on schools, districts, and colleges, where it's all in one place. You have to learn this, one set of tools we've created, but once you've learned that one set of tools, then for the most part, you don't have to go anywhere else to pull different data sources. It's all in one place, it's one language, it's standardized, it's harmonized, so that if you're pulling data from 1992 or 2017, it's all the same thing. You ask for something, it doesn't matter what year, we're not calling it something different. We've harmonized all of that. And the foundation for the Education Data Portal is something called an API, an Application Programming Interface. That's the technical infrastructure where all the databases live. And the great thing about that is most people aren't going to work with the API directly. It's really just for programmers who want to build tools to access the data. But it means that those programmers, including our programmers here at the Urban Institute, can build tools that make these data accessible to a wide range of audiences. So we've built packages for the statistical software programs, Stata and R. So a researcher who uses Stata or R with one line of code can pull the data that they need. Our communication specialists have also built very specific tools, and let me show you one here. I'm going to share my screen. This hasn't come out yet. We're going to make this live later this month. But this is just a pretty simple number. The idea here is for your local K-12 school, you want to know how demographics have changed over the last 30 years. And once again, it's a pretty simple set of numbers, but to get it for your school, you'd have to go pull 30 different years of data, the old data formats that are weirdly formatted that you need special training to read in. And because we put it all in one place, in just a couple of weeks, our programmers were able to build a tool where you can look at 30 years of enrollment data by race and ethnicity for all 100,000 plus schools in the country. So here, let's say we pick the District of Columbia, it loads the list of schools. Just for fun, I'll pull up the elementary school my daughter goes to here in Washington, D.C. It goes and pulls it, and there you have it. You can see the black line is total enrollment. You can see how total enrollment has fallen over time and then recovered in recent years. You can see how the demographics of the school have shifted over time to become more diverse. And so just one example of a little tool we were able to build on this API, but anyone out there, any media outlet or just, someone with a computer in their basement could go and build a tool to hone in on one particular thing. The tool we're going to talk about today, the Education Data Explorer, is meant to put all of the data at anyone's fingertips, even if they're not a computer programmer. So the way to think about it is some of these other ways of accessing the API, the Stata and R packages. That's if you want to get lots of data. Let's say you want data on all of the 100,000 schools. If you just want data on a couple schools, or maybe all the schools in your city or all the schools in your state, the Education Data Portal is a great place where you can go and pretty quickly just click around and spit out a spreadsheet you can open up in Excel with just the data that you want. So we think that reporters, education reporters, are a great audience for this tool because if you want to do that verification or contextualization that Rick talked about, you often don't want to sort through gigabytes of data on 100,000 schools. You know the school you're writing about, and you just want maybe a trend or one number for that. Maybe you want to put it in the context of the city or of the state, but you don't need data for the whole country. And the Data Explorer makes it easy to do that. Now, the Data Explorer can be a little overwhelming to work with because it really puts all of these data sets, all these data sources over many years at your fingertips. So we thought it would be helpful today to take just a few minutes to go through an example on schools, districts, and colleges, one example each, just to give you a quick overview of what information is in there, and then how do you do it with a couple of worked examples. So Erica is going to go through a schools example, then I'll talk about a district's example, and then Erica will close it out with a college example. And we really want to highlight that these tools are relatively new. We just launched the Data Explorer in 2019, less than a year ago, so we're continuing to make improvements. We want your feedback. Erica will say this again, something we'll say a bunch of times, but there's a feedback button on the website. You can email us. We really want ideas on how to make these tools better and make them more useful for different audiences. So with that, I'll turn it over to Erica.
Great, thanks, Matt. So what you should be seeing now, hopefully, is educationdata.urban.org, which is our Data Explorer. As Matt mentioned, it covers schools, districts, and colleges. And so the first thing you're going to do is choose one of these places to start. And we'll start with schools, and then as Matt said, I'll turn it over to him for districts, and then I'll take it back over for colleges. So just under here, there's a brief little overview of how to use the Data Explorer. First, we'll limit the data set, which is to say we'll choose which schools, districts, or colleges we're interested in. Then we'll choose the data, so the fields that we're interested in, whether that's enrollment or earnings after college or something like that. Export the data, and then using the data, which is up to you. I also wanted to point out that up in the top right corner here, there's a full API button. That takes you to our documentation site, which I'm just going to mention that's here. This is tells you basically all of the documentation for all of the data in the Explorer. You'll get this in some of this information in a data dictionary when you download your data, but this is, if you just want to see sort of everything, you can go here, and again, it's broken down by schools, school districts, and colleges, and you can see the different types of data sets that we have and the fields that exist for each of those. So let's just, and the other thing I wanted to point out is that there's a feedback button in the lower right-hand corner of the page. And so you can use that to give us feedback. And if you give us your email address as well, then we will try to get back to you. We'd like to know any feedback that you have, positive, negative questions, anything. You can also email us at educationdata@urban.org, which is basically the same as the URL, but with an @ so let's start with schools. Click here to get started. So the first screen you'll see here is the choosing your schools. You can choose a start year and end year. So I'm going to just start with 1 year of data for now, but as Matt mentioned, you can get a time series. And just the only thing you really need to fill in here is the state. So you can't, there's not an option to choose the entire US. You could do that if you really wanted to by choosing every single state manually and adding them, but it's really not designed for that. It's designed for smaller requests, and there's better tools like the full API I pointed you to if you really want all of the data, or reach out to us. But it will work probably, but it will take a long time. Then all the other fields are basically optional, and if you don't select them, you'll just get all of the schools in the District of Columbia. But let's choose the DCPS, the District of Columbia Public Schools. Then we could narrow down to a particular school if we wanted to, or we can choose by some of these filters. So I'm going to just filter down to high schools. We could also filter on charters or school types, so regular school, special education schools, that sort of thing. Then we'll go to choose your data. And so what you'll see here is a whole bunch of different categories of data. So you'll see that there are a bunch of default characteristics that are already selected, like school name, level, charter school, enrollment, things like that, that will be just sort of nice to have. Under school characteristics, there's lots of characteristics of the school, such as Title I status and Title I eligibility, whether it's a magnet school. Under enrollment, you can get enrollment cut a number of different ways, so by grade, race, or sex, or even by disability status, LEP status, so limited English proficiency, race or sex, as well as for your reduced price lunch. We've recently added a whole bunch of geographic and identification information by merging these data on to NHGIS data, so sort of geocoding data to add additional geographic characteristics to all the schools, so for the different census geographies. That's a lot of information right there. There's assessments data, so these are state-specific assessments in math and reading, and you can get the number of students taking these assessments as well as the low end of the range, high end of the range, and the midpoint, which we created to sort of give you an estimate of the fraction of students who are scoring proficient on the math and reading assessments. With data on AP, IB, and gifted and talented programs, so enrollment as well as AP test taking, chronic absenteeism, discipline, so this is suspensions, expulsions, arrests, harassment and bullying, which you can get broken down by allegations, students who are disciplined by harassment or bullying, as well as students who are victims of harassment or bullying. And a lot of these, you can see that there's a group by option, and you can really, you can break these things down by, say, disability or sex or race. There's also data on restraint and seclusion, and finally advanced options, which aren't really options, but just variables that we imagine most users are not likely to select. So those are under there. So let's go ahead. We've chosen a set of schools, high schools in DCPS, the District of Columbia Public Schools, and let's go and choose some data for them. So let's get some, let's get the data on AP enrollment. So let's take students enrolled in at least one AP course, and then science, math, and other courses. And let's get that broken down by race. And let's also scroll back up and get student enrollment broken down by race as well. There we go. Then we scroll back up to the top, hit generate, and the page will zoom to the bottom, and you'll see that the download is progressing. So instead of waiting for this, we've already downloaded these files, and I'll just go ahead and show you what you get. So one of the files you'll get is a data dictionary. So this tells you just which variables you downloaded, so a simple variable name, a label for that variable, and sometimes a little bit more of a description. So for example, for race, we give you a little bit more information about the changes in the race and ethnicity definitions over time. So that's a useful reference. And then you'll get two other, so you can see the downloads are progressing here. And then you'll get two other files. And the reason you'll get two files is that you'll get a school level file as well as a file broken down by race, because we asked for that breakdown. So this is the school level file. This just gives us a list of all the schools we asked for, and just sort of all those default variables that we asked for. So the enrollment, whether it's a charter school, regular school, et cetera. And then here is the enrollment data we asked for that's broken down by race. So here you don't see the charter flags and that sort of thing because that's not broken down by race. So that's sort of a lot of data. That's maybe a little bit more than we knew how to deal with. So one of the things that you can use in Excel that's pretty great is you can create pivot tables. And I'm not going to walk you through how to use a pivot table, but you can Google that or ask a colleague. But you can pretty quickly make little charts like this, where I've shown the fraction of students who are enrolled in AP courses. The blue is the total. The orange and gray are science and math. And the nice thing about the pivot table is you can toggle things, and it's very customizable. So you can say, maybe I don't want the total in there because it doesn't really make sense for some reason, and it'll take that out of your pivot table. And so that's sort of our school-wide example, and I'll turn it over to Matt to talk about districts. But as you can see, we've got these are the three files that downloaded while we were chatting about them. So turn that over to you.
Oh, great. Let me just check in to make sure we're here. All right. So turning over to school districts, it's going to work in a pretty similar fashion to schools. So I'll just quickly go over once again. You have a start year and an end year. Do you want just, depending on whether you want 1 year of data or whether you want up to 30 years of data. And obviously there'll be different pieces available for different years. But so let's say we want some 2016 data. We're looking at school districts in Massachusetts. So you can load those up. And as Erica said, same as with schools, if we do nothing, we're going to get all the school districts in Massachusetts. If we want to drill down and say just add a couple of school districts, we can type them in here. Say we want Boston Public Schools and Cambridge Public Schools. We would then just get data on just those two. So it's really pretty flexible in terms of, do you want a bunch of data for a whole state, or do you want just, you know, one or a handful of districts? Agency type is important here. We think school districts, we often think of our regular local school district. It's a geographic area, kind of a part of space that's carved out. That's not, there are other kinds of districts too. Often a charter school is part of a charter operator. So a charter operator like KIPP might run a bunch of schools in Washington, D.C. And for data purposes, KIPP in D.C. is a school district. So here we can say, do we just want those regular geographic districts, or do we want maybe the charter ones or multiple? So for now, I'll pick all of them. And then doing a quick tour of the data available for districts. We have a set of characteristics about those districts. Is it a K-12 district, or is it, in some states there are elementary and secondary districts that are separate, the number of schools associated with the district, the number of students that are enrolled. For enrollment, we have some information that's the same as we can get by school, where we can get student enrollment broken down by grade, race, and sex, or any combination of those. We also have a few pieces of information about students we can't get on schools, which is the number of special education students and the number of English language learners. So we can get that in district data, we can't get it in the school data. And finally, from census, we have some poverty data. So census every year estimates for every school district the number of people who live there, the school-age population, and the share of the school-age population that's in poverty. We have some geographic information about where the main office of the district is, the address, latitude, longitude, and so on. We have a lot more data on staff. So for at the school level, as Erica showed us, we can get the number of teachers, and that's about it. But for districts, we can get much more detailed information. We can get the number of teachers broken down by the grade they teach, the number of instructional aides, the number of guidance counselors, the number of librarians, the number of district-level staff, school administrators, district-level administrators, and so on. So a lot richer staff data is available at the district level than what the government makes available at the school level. And we have some of that same test data that Erica showed at the school level. We also have it at the district level. And the way the Department of Ed reports this is they don't often give you a number, they give you a range to try and protect students' privacy. So Erica pointed out we often use these midpoint of that range. Districts are going to be bigger, so those are going to tend to be a little bit more precise. And as with the enrollment, we can also group those test score data down by different groups, such as the grade in school, race, ethnicity, homeless, migrant, limited English proficiency. So if we wanted to understand the test performance of economically disadvantaged students or students of color, that's something we can pull out of the tool. And finally, at the district level, we have a bunch of detailed information on finances, on revenues, how much money comes from the state government, from the local government, from the federal government, how is the school spending money on salaries, on pensions, and so on. And if we go to get one of those, we'll see they're grayed out with this little red eye. And what this means is that I picked 2016, and those finance data aren't available for 2016 yet. It takes the federal government so long to make those finance data available that the 2016-17 data won't be available until sometime this year in 2020. So the way our tool works is if you can see what's available, and if it's not available for the years you've asked for, it lets you know that. It doesn't let you pick it. It lets you know if you want finance data, go back, pick 2015, and then you can get finance data. So for the example I'm going to show now, to show kind of a pretty simple example, let's look at poverty rates in the school districts in Massachusetts, the share of the school-age population in poverty. And let's look at test scores. Let's look at the percent that are proficient on the reading test. We can scroll back up, press the generate button, download those files, and then once again, so we don't have to sit here while they load up and you don't have to sit and watch me make a scatter plot in Excel, I'm just going to open that file. And you can see what we have here is it's a list of all those districts, and we can see we have enrollment and the reading scores for pretty much all of them. But we see we have a lot of missing poverty data. And that's because the poverty data are census data on those geographic areas. So we have those for the regular local school districts, but we don't have them for the charter agencies. So if we were actually doing this analysis, we probably would have just told the data explorer, just give me data on the regular districts because I'm interested in the poverty rates. But for our little example here, you can see that if there's something's unavailable, it'll just be blank. And we can turn that into a scatter plot and examine the relationship between the share of students in poverty, the poverty rate here, and the percent proficient here. And what we can see is that on average, districts with more kids in poverty tend to have lower test scores, lower proficiency rates, but there's a lot of variation. So if you look at a district in Massachusetts with a 10% poverty rate, and some of them, 30% of the kids are proficient in reading, and some of them more than 60% are proficient. So that is a quick example with school districts, and Erica will close out the tour here with talking about higher education and colleges.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So you probably get the drill by now. So we'll have the first screen you'll see is choosing your institutions, so pretty similar to the last ones. We'll choose 2014 for this particular example, and choose some institutions in Maryland. And it's the same sort of idea where we can either get all the institutions in Maryland, or we can search for a specific one, or we can filter on level and control. So let's choose sort of 4 or more year institutions that are public. Same thing, choose your data. Again, you'll get the default variables at the top, and then a number of different categories of data. So under academic libraries, there's some general information, services and resources, and expenditures across a number of different categories. Admissions, so this includes applications and admissions, enrollment, and requirements such as SAT and ACT scores. So they will give you the percentile scores as well as things like whether secondary school GPA is required, whether recommendations are required, that sort of thing. Then we have a whole bunch of college characteristics, which include things like flags for whether the institution is an HBCU or a tribal college, the highest levels of offerings and highest degrees offered, that sort of thing. Default and repayment. So we have the cohort default rate as well as the repayment rate, which is broken down by a bunch of different characteristics such as family income, dependent, independent, Pell Grant, not a Pell Grant, female, male, etc. We also have some earnings data. So you'll see earnings by year after entry. So this is measured at 6, 8, and 10 years after entry. And again, this is broken down by different groups. So family income, dependent, independent, male, female, etc. Lots of enrollment data. So we'll have full-time equivalent enrollment, fall enrollment broken down by a number of different characteristics, so level of study, full-time, part-time, race and sex, as well as by those same by age and sex, by state of residence for freshmen, percent of disabled students with disabilities. And again, just like the other categories, we have lots of geographic information where we've geocoded the latitudes and longitudes and merged on census geographies, so down to the block group number. So for some people that might be kind of interesting, lots of information on graduation rates, 100%, 200%, and 150% graduation rates, which means sort of for 4-year colleges, 4 years, 6 years, or 8 years out. Some of these graduation rates for certain years of data are broken out by type of federal aid, getting a Pell Grant, or by full-time or part-time. There's also retention, there's room and board charges, student aid applicant characteristics. So these are things like the family income of student aid, or students receiving federal aid. Lots of different characteristics here, such as, obviously gender, marital status, dependent, veteran, that sort of thing. Similar characteristics for home neighborhoods, so racial breakdowns of home zip codes, as well as median household income, that sort of thing. Student services, so things like remedial services, daycare, or ROTC. And again, a lot of advanced options like the Carnegie classifications and other characteristics of the institutions that not everybody may want, but they're there if you do. So we chose 4-year public institutions in Maryland. Let's go and choose some data for them, and let's pick earnings, because that's kind of interesting. And let's choose median earnings of students working and not enrolled. Again, go back up to the top, click generate, and it'll start downloading, but I've already downloaded it, so we can just open up that file and see what that looks like. So again, it looks like a lot of data, have all the institutions, and then for each institution, it looks like there's 3 rows, even though we just asked for 1 year of data. That's because, as I mentioned, the earnings data are for 6, 8, and 10 years after entry. So again, an easy way to analyze that is just to make that into a little pivot table or pivot chart. So here we've got all of the institutions along the bottom here, and then we have 6, 8, and 10-year out earnings. So they're sort of increasing over time for each of those institutions. But we can also just sort of filter that down and just choose to look at, say, 10-year out earnings or something like that. And sort of make that a simpler chart if we wanted to. So a pivot table is a great tool for these kinds of data. So here's the data. Again, we get 3 files, the institution level data, the data that's broken down by years after entry, and then a data dictionary. So that's it for our overview. I think, I hope that was helpful. Again, please, we're going to obviously answer some questions now, but if questions occur to you later, please email us at educationdata@urban.org or use the feedback button. But thank you all so much for hearing us out, and please try out the tool and let us know what you think. PreK, I think it's over to you.
Great, and thank you for that wonderful overview of the different sections of this tool. I want to spend a couple of minutes now talking about how data sets like this and data sets that are included in this tool can inform or even suggest stories for you. I referenced that a little bit at the top, but I'll break it down a little more as I see it. First, though, I want to remind you all, please do send in questions, submit them, and we'll take some time to answer them so that we can address things. Particularly if you're a K-12 reporter, I'm going to be looking through a lot of things through a higher ed lens because that's what I cover. So we want to hear from you so we can make sure that we're covering the things that are important to you. Now, typically, I will use some of the data sets that are in here from the higher ed side to get key information about a college or university. That's when I'm writing about it for any reason. Sometimes I've done it when I'm profiling a president, see how enrollment, finances, other characteristics have changed during that president's time in office. Sometimes it'll be a discussion about financial aid strategies. How have some of the different student groups that were profiled changed over time? Has the institution been enrolling more low-income students or fewer students who are Black as they shift their different strategies? You can also, with a little bit of work, see key characteristics like we talked about with how large an institution is. I find that to be very helpful given some of the large trends that I'm covering right now and that we are covering right now as different parts of the higher ed sector and different geographies see student populations moving in different directions. So it's really helpful to be able to hone in on one institution or a couple of institutions. So whatever story I've written, whether it is about faculty layoffs or a debt relief program that a small private liberal arts institution is trying, I probably used some of this data to back things up or to include in my reporting. I also want to mention over the summer, I did use some of this kind of data to do a much larger project that looked at, I think it was a couple hundred institutions. It was a lot to wrangle in Excel. I am not the greatest person with the heavier duty data software, but I want to mention you can do some really ambitious projects if you put in the time and are willing to sit through a few crashes of your computer or the Excel program. So it is possible to use this data for larger scale analyses. Even though it may not be easy, I recommend trying it out for something ambitious. So Matt and Erica, one thing I want to ask you to start out, though, or the first thing I want to ask you is, there was a lot of fuss recently about the federal government releasing a new data set under its college scorecard on program level debt and earnings. Is that part of this tool? I thought I saw some debt and earnings data, but I want to see if that new data set is in here or not.
Right. So the data that you saw are the institution level debt and earnings data. So we have not yet included the program level data. That came out pretty recently, about a month or two ago, I think. So we haven't had a chance yet to look at that and digest that. There is a bit of a lag in between how long it takes the federal government to release their data and for us to incorporate that into the tool, particularly if it's a brand new data set like this one is. We try to keep on top of the data as they're released by the federal government. As Matt mentioned, for example, the finance data at the district level. We have the most recent data that's available, and that's unfortunately from the 2015-16 school year, so it's just that old. But we are currently in the process of trying to update some of the other data sets to be the most recent available, but some of them are just not as recent as you might like.
I would also add that we're always having to make decisions to prioritize our efforts, like, well, what do we do? What do we do sooner? What do we wait on? What do we really rush to get up? So it's really helpful to get feedback from people on the example you raised, the program level debt and earnings data. Is that something people feel like they can just go get it because it's 1 year of data and they don't really, like, yeah, it'd be nice to have, but it's not critical. Do they see that as something that would make a huge difference for them if it was in the data portal? That kind of feedback is really useful to us because there's only so much we can do in any given year. So it helps us decide, do we prioritize that? Do we prioritize something else? So folks should always feel free to send us a message when something's missing they think would be really helpful.
Makes sense. I was going to be surprised if that new data was in there. Some of it I think is pretty messy, if I'm not mistaken, in the way it's released right now. So great. If I could ask a couple questions about the K-12 space, so I make sure I'm not focused too much on higher ed. I want to ask, are there specific financial or school quality indicators that you really recommend, that you in working with this think are particularly good?
So on the school quality side, there's going to be some input type measures and also output type measures. So input type measures for schools, you can look at the pupil-teacher ratio, and that's obviously a little bit messy because it's not average class size, it's just the ratio of pupils to teachers in the school, but it's the one measure the federal government puts out. We can also look at kind of the composition of the school, look for things like segregation, concentration of poverty. District level data, we obviously get those poverty data. We have more financial data at the district level, so we can look at how much is being spent, how many teachers are there of different categories. And then the main output measure we have right now is test scores, right? The percent proficient in reading and math on state assessments in grades 3 through 8. And obviously there's limitations to what test scores can tell you. That states change the test they use, so you have to be a little careful about using that over time.
Or across states.
Or across states. But that's certainly a useful starting point, right? At least looking at one state at one point in time to know both these schools had, say, a poverty rate of 30%, but one of them, 20% of the kids were proficient on the test, the other one 40% were proficient on the test. Doesn't necessarily mean the 40% is a better school, but it certainly raises an interesting question. You might want to go into those schools. You might want to try and learn more. And then the data that come from the Civil Rights Department. Erica talks about the AP data, the discipline data. That's also there's some school resource type measures in there as well in terms of our AP courses offered, how many students are taking them, how many students are taking the tests, how many students are doing well on the AP tests, those kinds of measures. And I think graduation rates aren't in there yet, but they're on our list of things to add this year. So starting to get some more output measures that are currently there. Great.
One other thing that you mentioned that I was really interested in on the K-12 side was tying in some of the place-based information. I think you said there was some income statistics or things like that, geocoded. I don't know how hard it is to do that otherwise elsewhere. I'm not familiar with anything that's available on the higher ed side like that. So I guess I have two questions. One is, how unique is that? And the second question is, any chance you could do that for the higher ed side? Because I think it would it would save me a lot of trouble when I'm trying to track down kind of where institutions are drawing from primarily.
So in terms of I think you're probably referring to the SAPI data, which is from the Small Area Income and Poverty Estimates put out by the Census Bureau. And so they've actually calculated those data at the school district level. And I think it's sort of more meaningful for K-12 because they tend to draw from the geographic, surroundings, whereas it's not true for all of the higher ed landscape, although it is for a lot of it. Right now, we don't have any plans to sort of generate those data ourselves. We have created sort of geocode matches for all the higher ed institutions to Census Bureau block groups, so you could match that up to, say, ACS data, American Community Survey data, and match that up yourself, but we haven't provided that linkage directly.
Do we have this enrollment by state of residence? Is that in here yet, or is that on our list?
Yeah.
So you can look up what state students are coming from, because ideally you'd want to know, right, is the community college drawing from the surrounding 2 miles, 5 miles, 10 miles, and those data just don't exist to the best of our knowledge. You'd need to know data on individual kids to generate that for, say, you could do that in the state. We couldn't do it nationally. But you could look at those enrolled by state of residence, so you could at least distinguish between colleges that enroll largely students from their state versus that enroll either regionally or nationally, and that information is in there.
Great, great. I should probably back up and actually talk about some more basic questions about working with data. Do either of you see mistakes that journalists tend to make when they try to use the kinds of data that are available in this tool?
Well, I think it's we haven't seen lots of mistakes. We try and provide enough context, and that's kind of the point of providing the code book. So we hope folks will take a look at that. There are sometimes weird things that people might know about the data. So Erica mentioned that you can get, in higher ed, you can get college enrollment broken down by race. You can also get it broken down by age. The data broken down by age are only done in either even or odd numbered years. I forget which one it was. And it's voluntary in the other years. So if you got a voluntary year, you're going to see a bunch of missingness. So I think the main advice I would offer to folks is if something seems weird, ask. Either Google it or just send us an email saying, hey, this thing with the iPad's age data seems kind of weird. In that case, we could tell you, oh, it's because it's voluntary in even numbered years. We might not always know, but I think you always kind of want to give the data a little bit of a smell test, especially since if you're reporting on a school, you know something about that school. You know, I think, enough to ask a question if something looks weird and not just to take it as a given.
Makes sense. And then along a similar line, are there any particular Excel or spreadsheet skills that you would recommend folks learn or make sure they have down when they need to work with this, since it exports to a CSV that would you have to work with an Excel or a like spreadsheet program?
I would say pivot tables are probably a pretty useful skill. You can learn them pretty quickly, and they're pretty intuitive. It's sort of a drag and drop kind of interface. You basically hit create pivot table, and then you can drag the different fields into rows or columns and create sums or averages or whatever, and then make that into different charts as well. So that's, I think, probably the biggest bang for your buck in terms of investing in skills. There's more complicated ones, but I think that's a pretty useful skill.
And that's especially important for those data sets where it's one school, but you get multiple observations, because it's, say, enrollment for different racial groups or for different racial and gender and grade groups. So if you get the number of, white boys in the first grade, that's going to have like 120 rows for every school. So those I'm a little embarrassed to admit, I didn't know pivot tables. I'd always do it in statistical software because I thought it sounded hard. And then actually our communications manager taught me how to do pivot tables. Also a former higher ed journalist. So you can, folks on this webinar definitely should be able to learn pivot tables. As Erica mentioned, it's a couple steps. Once you get the hang of it, it's a really useful tool for taking something that looks big and messy and almost building in some cases, a little interactive for yourself, right? Where you can just say, I want to look at one school at a time. I want to click around. I want to add things. I want to take things off. So it's definitely worth the effort.
Okay. I want to just take the conversation pivot back to audience questions now, if that's okay. And if we breeze through them, we can kind of go back to Rick, because I know you had a ton to go through, but want to give some time to our audience. And before I go into questions, just reminding everyone, if you're typing questions to the questions box, please include your name and affiliation. Also, a quick reminder in case anybody is about to sign off or before you sign off, please make sure to fill out the survey. It's going to pop up when you X out of the program. The survey questions help us create the best program and content for you and let us know what you liked or didn't like or where we could improve. So please, 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 it's really important to us. So with that being said, I think the first questions, we got a couple of people asking about when the data sets you plan to be updating them, because it seems the most recent data is from 2016 and 2017. So do you have any sort of timeline you can give people?
Yeah, so most of the lag there is just the lag of the federal government. Mm-hmm. So for the K-12 schools, for example, I think in the fall, the 17-18 data came out, and we're hoping to have those up in a couple of months. I think we're targeting April for that update. In the future, we're hoping to decrease that time. So when they came out in October to April, it's about 6 months. We're hoping to get that down to maybe 2 or 3 months in the future. But there's always going to be that couple-year lag just because of how long it takes the federal government to gather data from all these states and then make it available. And then we should hopefully be able to get pretty quick at grabbing it from the federal government and putting it into the portal so that our users have the most up-to-date data that you could get anywhere.
Okay, great. And then we have a kind of companion question to this from Carrie Mitchell with the Advocate Media in Dallas. And then she was saying we're in places where the data comes up short, like you mentioned, in some places it'll show up blank because it's just not available. Is there a way to find out the source of the data so that they could FOIA local entities for the correct documents to follow up?
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention in the, this is only partly answering the question, I think, I don't have it up anymore. In the data dictionary, you do get a source. So I didn't really talk about this a lot, but we have a number of different data sources that we're relying on. One is the Common Core of data for a lot of the schools and districts data. The other is the Office of Civil Rights data collection. That's a large one that we use, and so you'll get that information in the data dictionary. You'll see where a particular field is coming from. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, that would tell you where the data is coming from, but if it's blank, the source, obviously, it means that they don't have the information. So they wouldn't be the place to ask. Mm-hmm. I think in most cases, you'd want to go back to the school or district itself and kind of ask and say, hey, there's this federal data set. You were around that year. How come we didn't report the information? And you have to direct that FOIA request to, I guess, to the district, or in some cases, it's states that compile the information from districts.
Okay. And then a question from Jennifer Palmer. Can the tool compare states in an apples to apples way? So can you do side-by-side state comparisons?
It depends on what the data are. So the state assessments are state specific, and so I would strongly recommend that you don't do that for the assessments. For some of the other, I think it really depends on the variable. I mean, if you are looking at, enrollment, those are just numbers of students. That's comparable, but Matt, I don't know if you have.
I would say in most cases you can. I would say for the most part these are federal data sets, and so, but like Erica said, just think about what it is you're looking at. If you're counting people, well, counting people tends to mean the same thing in different states. If you're counting dollars, with some exceptions, that tends to mean the same thing in different states. Maybe having to think a little bit about cost of living. So I think the ones to be really careful about are those state test assessment data, because that just means percent proficient on the Maryland test means something potentially different from percent proficient on the Virginia test, and those tests change over time. So that's one to be a little careful about. And the plug for, I know you guys had the Stanford folks on, I think one of your webinars a few weeks ago. If you want test score data that are comparable across states, they've done a terrific job. I think their website is edopportunity.org. Extremely complimentary to the work we're doing, so highly recommend that. And we're actually thinking about in the next couple of years, could we bring in some of those data points to have them as part of our resource, but for visualizing and making those cross-state comparisons, they've built a great tool for that.
Yes, and that webinar, for anyone who is interested or missed it, that lives live on our website, so you can watch that to learn about that tool too. And then we have a question from Matthew Kaufman, and he says, it looks like everything exports as a CSV. Is there any consideration of making the results available in one or more chart forms that reporters could grab and embed?
Yeah, so we're thinking about building these more, so that would have to be much more targeted. So the goal of the Education Data Explorer is to put all of these data at your fingertips so you could get everything. So that would make it hard to build one visualizer that would build a chart off of anything, because it's not clear what that would be. So that little example I showed you with enrollment by race and ethnicity over the last 30 years for any school in the country, that's an example of one thing we've built and we'll put out in the next couple of weeks. Where in chart form you can get one piece of information. So over the next year or so, we're going to be trying to talk to folks, including education journalists, to understand what kinds of tools like that would be most useful. So in the future, we can build more specific tools that would do that kind of visualization on the fly for you, do that kind of analysis on the fly for you. Before we just make those decisions, we want to know what would be most useful. So that's another area where folks should shoot us an email and say, hey, this has nothing to do with the Data Explorer, but one thing that my colleagues and I all the time, we're trying to grab and it takes us forever is X. Tell us what that is. And then we can put that on our list of ideas for something we might build down the road.
Gotcha. And then we have a question from Cynthia Jones from Chalkbeat. It's a two-part question. One is, any thoughts to eventually adding pre-K data, an example, enrollment and funding? And then for the second part of the question, what attribution should reporters use when pulling from these databases and tools?
Both great questions. So on pre-K data, we have, I think, most of what's available, which nationally is not very much. So we have data that, because the unit of analysis is schools, districts, and colleges, so it's for schools that have pre-K programs in their schools. So not all the pre-K in Washington, D.C. is in the public school system, but a lot of it is. You can look up those numbers. So my kids were in pre-K here in D.C. They'd be in those enrollment counts in the pre-K grades. I believe the civil rights data have some information on pre-K absenteeism that we don't have in the tool just yet, but are on our list for the next year or two. So there will be some more of that in the future, but it'll be more pre-K as it relates to the public school system, as it happens in K-12 schools and districts, whereas pre-K that happens in other systems, it's a little bit hard to capture in the framework we've created for the Data Explorer, but we certainly, folks want to send us ideas on how to do that, we're all ears. Attribution for on both that portal full documentation site, and I believe on the Explorer site too, we have a suggested citation. So I think I can show you my screen here. And if we go to the About button, I believe there is citing these data. We suggest a citation. Obviously, if you're writing a story, we don't expect you to have citations in your story. So the basic idea here is that these are data collected by the federal government. We encourage you to name the data set if it's from a particular data set. And then if you can, to mention that you got it from the Urban Institute's Education Data Explorer. So here's the formal citation. And obviously, in a reporter that built a figure with a source note might be able to include that citation. Obviously, in a story, you're going to have to adjust it a little bit to match your own style and preferences.
Great. And a question from Elizabeth Davis is, what are the disability breakdowns available at school and district levels?
This is a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, but if you email me, I'm happy to get back to you on that one.
And a bunch of those enrollment data have some disability breakdowns. It's usually a yes or no. It's not a detailed category of disability, right?
It's definitely not by disability, but I forget if it's sort of 504 status or something else.
So there's definitely some data in there, and you can provide some more information on request.
Great. And then a question from our own Kim Clark here at AWA. She asked if you might speak to a little bit, how do you deal with mismatch in IDs? Like if you have school IDs like for regular iPads versus like the college scorecard when you're pulling it?
Yeah, so that's a problem that we've wrestled with a lot. So the iPad's identifier is the unit ID, and scorecard identifier is an OPE ID, which is slightly different. And so we've treated iPads as sort of the universe, and iPads includes also an OPE ID. So we've used that identifier to merge to the college scorecard.
Great. Thanks. And then I think I've gone through pretty much all of our audience questions here. Rick, did you want to try to get in? We have a couple minutes left. Do you have maybe like one or two questions to get in before the end?
Sure. I would just ask kind of generally speaking, are there any other caveats about using this data that we should be aware of? You discussed a lot of things, whether that is the how to cite it or specific years that maybe data isn't available for. Are there other things that maybe generally speaking we should be aware of, whether there are certain years that might be estimated data and how that's marked? Things like that, just to be on the lookout for?
I think one general thing I would say is that they're self-reported data. So sometimes there are mistakes in the underlying data. So you'll get, if you try to calculate percentages or something, you might get a percentage that's over 100% because somebody sort of misunderstood the question or put something in the wrong box or something. So if you're seeing extreme outliers, I would dig deeper and make sure if you're trying to run a story based on one particular number as opposed to an average or something, to make sure that that's the real number, because sometimes there are mistakes like that and that we have not tried to correct.
Just one thing I'd add is more recent years of data are going to tend to be richer. There's going to tend to be more available. So if you want to look at trends over 30 years, it's going to be more limited in terms of what's going to be available for you. Whereas in more recent years, you're just going to have a lot more options. And that you can kind of see as you play with the tool. If you pick a big year range of data, you're not going to get all the years you want. So we have really just, it's a pretty, I think, faithful harmonization of what the federal government makes available. So for the most part, we're just, as Erica said, the schools, the colleges report it to the feds, and then we grab it and put it up here. So you always have to take it with some grain of salt. As I said before, if something looks a little off, let us, you can let us know, and we can check and say, hey, did we make a mistake when we were putting it up there? And if we did, we'll fix it. Or is this just something weird? And I know reporters have written before about things like in the civil rights data collection, a school reported having, 150 school shootings or something that was just obviously not right? Someone just filled in the wrong box or put the decimal in the wrong place. So you always want to be aware of that possibility before you just believe something.
Yeah, that's a great point. I always find no matter how big or detailed the CSV is, I usually end up picking up the phone anyway to talk to somebody. So thank you so much.
Great. Well, then with that, I think we'll just wrap our webinar here. I want to thank our guests, Rick, Matt, and Erica again. And I'd like to thank today's attendees and EWA members. And as soon as this webinar closes, again, I just want to remind you, you'll see that pop up for the evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is very important to us and helps us improve our quality of our programming. And finally, just one last thing, visit ewa.org/events to sign up for upcoming online and in-person seminars. For instance, scholarships are still available for our February event on adolescent development hosted in sunny Berkeley, California. So you can go check that out on our website. Otherwise, thank you so much and have a great day, everybody.